I'm Million Saint-Hilaire, and in this video we're going to take a look at MeshCentral supports for LDAP membership groups. In a previous video, we looked at how MeshCentral can support LDAP so that you have an Active Directory or LDAP server that is in your organization, and MeshCentral can be hooked up to it so that users that have information in the LDAP directory, users who have login credentials in that directory, can also work with MeshCentral. So now they don't have to create a new account inside MeshCentral. They can log in using their LDAP credentials. So in this video, we're going to go one step further and look at the membership groups that are in LDAP. And we're going to take advantage of those membership groups in two different ways in MeshCentral. So let's take a look at, first of all, my demo setup. I have my standard developer server right here. It's running as a command line utility, and I have the web page, and of course it works. I can connect to a machine and everything works fine. Okay, so now I've already hooked up this instance to LDAP, so I have an Active Directory. And so when I log out here, I can log in using Active Directory. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to run MeshCentral --debug LDAP. And this way, we're going to see what's going on with LDAP on the console here. So if I log in, let's see, administrator, put in my password, say OK. So, oh, it says do not, oh, I mistyped it. Administrator, type in my password, and there we go. So the first time I mistyped it, it says no such user. The second time it says user logged in, and I have an image. This is my real name, this is my identifier, and so on. So I'm logged in with LDAP. Everything's working so far. Okay, so before I go into membership groups of LDAP, I'm going to go on my, I'm doing an RDP session onto my domain controller, and I'm going to use this LDAP browser, and I'm going to connect to my domain controller, the LDAP, and I'm just going to browse here, and inside my Active Directory, there's a bunch of users, and I'm going to take a look at administrator. This is one of my users, and you're going to see all these values. When you log in, all these values are passed to MeshCentral, but there's a bunch of values here called memberOf, and this point to a unique identifier for a user group in my LDAP or in my Active Directory. So administrator is part of 6, is that right? 6 different groups right now. So when you log in, MeshCentral can get access to this and can use that. Okay, so let's go back to MeshCentral, and this time I'm going to go to my config.json file. And we're going to take a look at how I configured LDAP here. So in the domain section, it says auth LDAP, of course. Then there's all these keys. Now, I'm putting an underscore under all of these because I'm just keeping the default for all of these. And then there's my LDAP options. This basically says how I want to connect to the LDAP server, so the login and the credentials and password. So that's great. Okay, so this is what we covered in the previous video. But this time I am going to add one more string, and it is this string called LDAPUserGroups. And by default, it is memberOf. Member, no space, capital O-F. And this basically is points to the data that contains the membership groups in LDAP. So whatever you see here, memberOf with a capital O and all lowercase except for the O and no space, well, that string is the one that you want to put inside LDAPUserGroups. You want that. So that basically tells MeshCentral when you get that user profile, look for this string as the LDAP membership to see what members of what groups this user is. And by the way, the default is memberOf with capital O. So even if you leave that blank, it will not do anything. It will still use memberOf. But if you have another string here, then you can do that. Okay, now that we kind of know that MeshCentral will receive these groups, what can we do with that? Well, the first one is there's this new string called, I'm going to paste it here. It is called LDAPUserRequired group membership. And this string, when active, has one string or an array of strings of groups, and you must be at least a member of one of these groups that you specify in here in order to log into the server. So I could put just the string like this, and that would be okay. Or I can put brackets for an array, and then I can put multiple membership groups. So I would have, group number 1, group number 2, number 3, and basically as soon as you specify this, users must be part of at least one of these membership groups in LDAP in order for the MeshCentral server to accept the login. Okay, so I'm just going to demonstrate that. And I am going to put an X here, so X domain admin. So this is not, this is not a group I'm part of. So I'm going to reset the server, and I'm going to, of course, be in debug again. And I'm going to log out, and I'm going to go and say, I'm going to log back in and say OK. Now, when I log in, this is my correct username and password, but because I'm not part of this membership group in LDAP, the MeshCentral server should reject my connection. So I'm going to hit login, and it's going to say deny login to user that is not a member of a LDAP required group. And it says access denied. So notice it didn't say invalid username and password. It says access denied. That means you do not have the rights to access this instance of MeshCentral. Now, if I were to go back into my config here, remove the X. So this is actually a group that I'm a member of. I'm going to restart the server so that this config is now active. And then I'm going to log in. There we go. And boom, here I am logged in. So obviously this is super useful if you're a large organization and you want to connect MeshCentral to an LDAP server, but you don't want everybody in the LDAP server to be able to access MeshCentral. You want to restrict that to a subset of people. Then you would use that feature. Okay, so that's usage number 1. Usage number 2 is, let's suppose I want to grant some computers or some device groups, I want to grant them to some users in my organization based on their membership. So I want, for example, this AMT15 machine to be available to somebody in my organization if they have a certain membership. So normally what you would do if you didn't have if you didn't have LDAP, what you could do is you could click on this machine and say add user, and you could add their identifier and their permissions. So you could do that. Another option you have, and I'm going to go here, and you'll notice this, ignore the top one, but what you could do is create the device groups, and you could add users to that group and add devices and device groups. And so what happens is that now, if I'm a user in MeshCentral and I'm part of a user group and that user group has access to some things, then I get access to those things. So devices or device groups. Okay, so the way we're going to implement LDAP membership to impact what I have access to is that what we're going to do is we're going to basically mimic in MeshCentral the groups that are in LDAP. So when you log in as a user, the groups that you are a member of will be automatically created as user groups inside MeshCentral. And so, and your membership to those groups will be automatically set up. And then if LDAP removes one of those memberships and you relog in, then MeshCentral will notice that you're no longer part of a certain user group, and it will remove you from the user group inside MeshCentral. So basically you have user groups here, and if you click on them, they'll say group type LDAP. Instead of no type at all, these special groups will be LDAP. And also, a couple of other things that's interesting is that you can't add or remove members to these special LDAP groups. Because, of course, they're controlled by the LDAP or Active Directory. They're not controlled by MeshCentral. So as an administrator of MeshCentral, you cannot add or remove users to these groups. You can add and remove devices and device groups, so you can change what these groups are allowed to do, but you cannot change the membership. The membership has to be changed in LDAP. Now, another thing is you cannot delete these groups except if there's no users in them. If there's no users currently inside that group, so then you can go ahead and click delete here and delete that device group. Okay, so I just deleted the LDAP device group. And then what I'm going to do is demonstrate how I can log in and have these LDAP device group automatically show up. Now, this is not done by default. And one of the reasons it's not done by default is that, as somebody pointed out on GitHub, some organizations have maybe tens of thousands of different groups. And some users are parts of hundreds of groups. So what happens is that if you log into MeshCentral and you're a user that has 100 group that you're a member of, then if I were to enable this feature by default, every single group you're part of would be auto-created. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on that feature completely. So I'm going to turn it on fully, and then later on I'm going to talk about limiting it. So what you do is you say LDAP sync with user groups. That's the key, and you put true. And if you just put true, then the thing I just talked about was going to happen. When somebody logs in, then automatically all the user groups, all the membership groups that are part of an LDAP will be created as user groups. So I just set that up to true. I'm going to reset my server. I'm going to log in again, and now we'll really watch what happens in the debug window. So now, remember, I have this new option now set up, LDAP sync with user groups. This is set to true. When I log in, immediately what happened is that I logged in and MeshCentral noticed, wait, I'm part of 6 different groups. So it created these new groups that didn't exist and added me to them. And so if I click on my users and groups, you'll notice that I have 6 LDAP groups, and I've been added, so there's 1 user in each of them because I've been added to all of them. Okay, so that's how that works. And of course, if I log in again, let's suppose I just log out and log back in. Let's see. Then MeshCentral will notice, well, these device groups already exist, and I'm already part of all of them. So it will just do nothing. Obviously it will look and see that everything's fine. But this is if I was removed from a user group, then what would happen is as soon as I log in, I would get removed from these groups. So MeshCentral, every time you log in, syncs up your user profile with the LDAP groups. And now if I click on an LDAP group, again, you'll see that the delete option is not there. I can't add users to this group. And the other thing that's interesting is if I go to a normal user group, like this one, and I say actually I'll go to my user profile. So this is my LDAP user profile inside MeshCentral. And then you'll see I'm part of all these groups. And you'll notice I can only delete the test group. So there's a little trash can here, meaning that I can remove myself from this test group, but I can't remove myself from the LDAP groups. So I'm going to go and say delete, remove. And then when I remove myself, you'll notice here the add user group link showed up. I can click and say add myself to a new group, but I can't add myself to any of the LDAP groups, only one of the normal groups. And so I click OK, and that works. And the reason, by the way, why the link doesn't show up, the add doesn't show up here anymore, is because MeshCentral knows there's no other group I can join. So that link doesn't show. OK, so hopefully that makes sense. It makes it possible to now just grant access to devices, and then when a user first comes in, they'll see the devices that were granted. Okay, so now the other thing is, well, if you have hundreds of groups that are part of your organization, you may end up with hundreds or even thousands of these LDAP groups, all over here. So what you may want to do is limit what LDAP groups you want MeshCentral to mirror as a user group. And so I'm going to go back to the config.json here. And instead of LDAPSyncWithUserGroups, I am going to use a special version of that. Instead of specifying just true, I'm going to specify filter. And then in filter, I am going to specify one or more substrings of groups that I want part of the membership groups that I want to sync. So basically what I'm saying is, only if a user logs in and they're part of many LDAP membership groups, only mirror the groups that have CN equal enterprise admins. So any group that has this substring in it, then it will get matched up. So this is nice because now I won't have to deal with hundreds of these groups that I really don't care about. So I'm going to reset the server, start again with this new setting, and I'm going to log out. And then when I'm going to log in again, administrator, password, when I'm going to log in again, what's going to happen is that MeshCentral is now going to only take a look at or care about groups that have CN equal enterprise admin. And so what it's going to do is I'm going to log in. And the first thing it does is it says, well, OK, I'm logged in. There's 5 of the 6 groups that are ignored now. And so it's going to kick me out of these 5 groups that are no longer considered by MeshCentral. And so you'll notice that here, CN equal enterprise admin, I'm still a member of, but all the other ones, I'm no longer a member of. And by the way, these groups, now that have 0 users, I can delete them. So I can click on this one, and I can say, and by the way, I can click on all of them, but if I say delete the group and say confirm, you'll notice that the enterprise admin group doesn't get deleted. And that's because I can't delete it. It's an LDAP group that has an LDAP type group that has at least 1 user in it. Okay, so that's great. Now I only have this group, and then I can do Control-C. Actually, I didn't have to Control-C. What I wanted to do is log out and log back in. Administrator, my password, boom. And then when I logged back in, it looked at my user groups, it resynchronized, of course, and it said, everything's fine. So it didn't try to create all the groups. It's only considering this one. So I hope this was clear, but this is super, super important because now what you can do is not only block access to users using a MeshCentral instance based on membership groups inside LDAP, but you can now set up membership groups inside LDAP to give access to very specific user device groups or specific devices. And so when a user logs in with their LDAP credentials into a MeshCentral instance, they can be granted exactly the permissions to the device that you want. So hopefully that was clear. Thank you very much and have a great day.